Peace and love, family. Peace and love. Welcome to another Read Book Club discussion. Tonight we are reading chapter 6 of Booker T. Washington in Africa, The Making of a Pan-Africanist by Dr. Tyrene Wright. Family, when I say that this was a powerful chapter, I'm not going to get into it right now, but I'm going ahead and pass the mic to Brother T. Brother T, go ahead and introduce yourself to the listening audience.
Hello, family. Once again, thank you so much for coming to the Read Book Club. We're tackling chapter 6, right? Chapter 6, right? Here we go. Just making sure. Always a pleasure seeing you in the chat. Make sure you please hit the like button and share the stream out. Dr. Wright?
Oh, good evening. Thank you again for having me on. So I'm excited about this because this is sort of like one of the money chapters, like this is this is like what it's all leading up to, right? So yeah, so I'm excited for this talk.
Absolutely. And Dr. Wright, I always say this, and I know you're probably tired of me saying it live on air. I want to say that it's always an honor when you join the panel. You bring so much context to the material that we're reading. And this is, like I've been telling people, this is a first. We've never had an author join us. And not only did you join us once, you've consistently joined us throughout the discourse of this book. And you'll tell us, yeah, you all are on the right track, or yeah, you touched on the right points. And, just having you here is just, it's just wonderful. And so we thank you, for your presence, and we thank you for your wisdom. We thank you for the knowledge that you shared in this book. Family, make sure you go to Booker T. Washington in Africa.com and get this gift that Dr. Wright has created for our community. You all know, and all of us were operating with the perception that Booker T. Washington was a number of things. We said some things about him, and our perception was largely based on a white liberal, right? Who had the authority, or he was, I know I probably butchering it, but it was a white liberal who wrote his history. Okay, so he gave us his version of who Booker T. Washington was and is, and we ran with it, right? Called him all kinds of names. And I remember back when we were reading Blueprint for Black Power by Dr. Amos Wilson, there was a brother Shimshu, and he's in the building. Shout out to brother Shimshu Netcher. He was arguing with us, Brother T, like, what? Booker T. Washington, he was a bad man. He was, that's my guy. And we like, what? He was this and he was that. But we were arguing at that time, in that time and space, we were arguing from a position of ignorance. And so Brother Shimshu had already did his research, and, and so he concluded that no, Booker T. Washington wasn't any of the things that we thought he was. But at that point, we were again arguing from a position of ignorance. And so shout out to Brother Shimsu. Appreciate you, brother. I see Brother Everett, Real Truth and Power, is in the building. Peace to the New Black World Order. Our moderators in the building. I see a beautiful mind. Peace to you, Queen. And I also see our Queen, Crystal Denise. Congratulations, Sister Crystal Denise. I saw that you were honored about a week ago. So congratulations to you, Queen, for that. And it's well deserved. Before we get started on tonight's discussion, I want to make a few announcements. Maybe a few days ago, I had a discussion, a hosted discussion on my platform about Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. And I stated that Howard University owes the Cress family a public apology. Dr. Frances Cress Welsing was fired or terminated from Howard University in 1975 because of her views about racism. And she talked about white survival and white genetic annihilation and all of that stuff. And she was fired from Howard University. And so we have a campaign going on, family. If you're on Twitter, it's hashtag apologizeHU. Make sure that you share. And I'm going to put the video in the chat. So make sure that you share this video, or you can go to my Instagram page at dr.maat_, okay, and grab some videos off the page and share it, family, okay, because we want a public apology. And Sister Donto, as the lead Dawn told, she said, forget an empty apology. She said, we want more than a daggone apology. She said, what they need to do is not only apologize, but then create a course at Howard University where they're actually teaching the ISIS papers. And so she said, we need more from Howard, since this is supposed to be the premier HU. All right. And so, family, I've dropped the link to the video. I dropped the link to the video in the chat. And so make sure you check out the video, share the video, #apologizeHU on Twitter as well as Instagram. Also, family, write the president. Your sister, Dr. I don't play. I don't play. I wrote the president. I'm not going to ask you to do anything that I don't do myself. Okay. So we see a letter to the president right here from your sister, Dr. Ma'at. It says, greetings, Mr. President. A campaign has launched among grassroots organization demanding that Howard University issue a public apologize to the family of Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. In 1975, Dr. Welsing was fired from Howard University for her views on racism, which have now been vindicated. Her sister, Miss Lauren Cress Love, 87 years of age, I butchered that, she's actually 88, 87 years of age, is the last living member of Dr. Welsing's immediate family. She expressed in a recent interview how Dr. Welsing and her family were deeply impacted by the dismissal from Howard. So many of our ancestors and their family members have died without witnessing justice. Please do not allow this to happen to Miss Lauren. And I went into how I can arrange a virtual meeting between, you and Miss Lauren. It says, which will be live streamed on my platform, during which Miss Lauren can receive a verbal apology. And I would also like a written apology to be published on howard.edu. If you would like to speak with me, feel free to contact me at. So I made sure I did that. And shout out to my sister, Amina. She made sure that she hollered at the president. She wasn't as nice as me, Brother T, when she wrote her letter. She went in. She started talking about the black bourgeois and how they always stop African-centered thought.
Well,
my sister went all the way in, and she CC'd me on the email, family. And so, go ahead, Brother T.
But Dr. Ma'at, the way you was fired up on that presentation of the letting us know the email and also the phone number, she had no choice but to put the fire in the letter.
So you blaming me, Brother T. I was just so heated. Like it's just long overdue. And so, family, the president's email address is hupresident@howard.edu. Okay. The first time I wrote at howard.org, and Gmail sent it right back, right? They sent the email right back. All right. And so, family, make sure you email the president, hupresident@howard.edu. His name is Wayne Frederick, and demand a public apology. All right. And so, anyway, Brother T, go ahead and start us off, Brother T.
Okay. Chapter 6, family, the African Exclusion Measure. This chapter here was on the first page, which I'm going to stress, was the early participation on foreign affairs. We started off the chapter reading one of the quotes from Booker T. Washington, which I'll read right now. Through your newspaper, I desire to appeal to the American Congress and to the people of the United States in favor of fair play and justice in the connection with immigration bill now pending before the United States Senate, which by amendment excludes from coming into country any person of African descent. And this is a quote directly from Booker T. Washington. The chapters opens up talking about Benita Johnson. Benita Johnson was arguing that between the times of 1935 to 1944, that there was immigration affairs that was stressed. But we see from this quote alone that Booker T was talking about immigration affairs as early as the early 1900s, as we know as 1915, as the chapter talks about. So we have to stand corrected, or Benita Johnson stands corrected based off of saying that affairs for African affairs, affairs for Caribbeans and other African descent was as early as 35 to 44, But we found out from this chapter that African affairs were definitely being held by our ancestor, Booker T. Washington, as early as 1915, and that he fought to make sure that Africans were not excluded from entering into the Americas.
Absolutely. And Brother T, I thank you for that introduction. And so from this page, this first page, what I realize is, as Dr. Wright wrote, and as you stated, Brother T, that the African American people, we were involved in American foreign policy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we were involved in that. And so Benita thought it was, between 1935, 1944. And as you stated, Brother T, we have evidence now to show or to support that we were involved in American foreign policy as early as 1915. And that's what Dr. Wright, was trying to get across to us.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to think if there's anything that I wanted to add. I don't think it's anything I wanted to add. Dr. Wright, that you want to add to that we were involved in this. And I think that's what you were trying to get across on the first page, is that, look, this author is saying that our involvement in American foreign policy started as early as 1935. But wait a minute, here's the evidence now showing that it was earlier. I think that's probably what you wanted to get across. Mm-hmm.
Yes, exactly. So thank you for highlighting that, because first of all, let me say, this young sister, and I don't know where she's at now or anything like that, but she was a graduate student, not a PhD student, but a graduate student, probably with just a master's, when she actually wrote this article that ended up being published in the Journal of Pan-African Studies, a journal that I sit on the editorial board for now. It was, a major contribution, because, this is a topic that some of us are not even clued in on, that we have a history and a tradition of pressuring the U.S. and its lawmakers and policymakers and legislators to be just to African people internationally, right? So we internally leverage our power in favor of African people internationally. And so it's a tradition. And so the insight for her to write this, and when was this published? This was around 2007. This was published. So you can just imagine, just as a graduate student, she thought that was an important point to make, and enough to write an article on. So yes, but I build on that and say that it's actually even earlier than that we are chiming in, right, with the Liberian crisis, but then of course, definitively, in a way that would impact the demographic in our communities here, we have been chiming in on U.S. foreign policy as it relates to African people internationally.
And so,
that's important.
And see, Dr. Wright, and see that. And so I think just knowing that, and I just want to be candid with you, it really just shows the Pan-African spirit in Africans in America. It shows our Pan-African spirit, but it does bother me. And I understand that it's not a huge element of African people. I've been to Africa a few times, and they are very welcoming and but it does bother me when some of our Jamaican brothers and sisters come over here, or our Trinidadian brothers and sisters come over here, or some of the brothers and sisters from the continent come over here and align themselves with our open enemy. Because I'm sitting back here thinking like, well, looking at this history, I was reading it today, and I was like, damn it, then so it's kind of like a spit in the face, right? Like, one of our greats is really responsible, and that's why I titled the show Black Immigrants Would Not Be in the U.S. had this not happened. And we'll get into this later. But we do know that if it wasn't for him, a lot of our brothers and sisters wouldn't be here. They wouldn't be here setting up Caribbean cafes or restaurants and carryouts, which I actually patronize. I actually went and had some ackee and saltfish earlier today, and some broiled dumpling and some plantain and some broiled banana and all of that. So I eat that stuff, right? And most of my friends, a lot of my friends come from different places. I have friends from Nigeria. I have friends from Ghana. I have friends from Jamaica. And I'm not saying that those are the people who are aligning themselves with our open enemy, but there is an element of brothers and sisters who do align themselves with our open enemy. And so Dr. Wright, do you think that's because those brothers and sisters are ignorant of this history?
Yes,
Mm.
absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why this conversation is so important and the case is so important because, I'm from New York. So I know exactly what you're talking about to the point where there are whole entire Black communities, Black immigrant communities, right? And very often the attitude is like, yo, this is our community. We settled this. And it's like, oh, no, not really. Let me give you a little history. You didn't integrate anything. We are the ones, you, first of all, when you immigrate into this country, you're not integrating, you're not moving into a white neighborhood. You're coming into Black communities that are
Yep,
already established
that's right.
because you couldn't integrate. First of all, let's be clear about America. America residential neighborhoods are overwhelmingly not integrated for the most part. In New
That's a
York
fact.
City, you can still wander into a neighborhood that is ironclad white and possibly have your life threatened. And we know
Mm.
that there's a history of that going all the way back to Yusef Hawkins and other people who crossed that invisible line over into other communities and didn't make it back. So listen, I totally get it. I'm a person who I'm from, New York. I'm from Brooklyn originally, and where I'm from originally, Clinton Hills, that's overwhelmingly, it was always sort of one of the few communities that are probably like blended, but the Black people that were there were African American.
Hmm.
Later
Hmm.
on, I moved to a neighborhood that is in proximity to East Flatbush, but was Kensington section. And the children I went to school with were overwhelmingly first generation, right? Their parents immigrated here. They were first generation born in this country. So they were all, majority of them from the Caribbean, a handful from Central America, but majority first generation US born parents from the Caribbean, right? So
Right.
I definitely know, and in them their parents planted certain seeds in terms of thinking about African so-called American people. Do you get what I'm saying?
Oh yeah, I'm with you. Hmm.
I'll tell a quick story, even though it's like an unsavory one. I had a classmate, a boy, who had the nerve to say to me one time, like, "Oh, your ancestors were slaves," and as though his were not. And I think he was Guyanese or something like that. So he made that comment to me. And interestingly enough, I come from a household where we discuss history and politics and all of that. So I knew history. Now, I didn't know his specific history, but I went home and I told my mother and we discussed it. And she said, "Well, I don't know what he's talking about because the first Africans who were enslaved arrived in the Caribbean first." And that is a fact.
That
Anybody
is
who
a
knows
fact.
that,
Yeah.
right, in the Caribbean and South America. So when I go back to school the next day, I inform him, like, listen, you were some of the first slaves in the hemisphere. So let's be very clear about this. You're not absolved. And I gave him a whole lot other more information. So then he didn't want to have the conversation. But
Of course.
so those things existed, but see that's the ignorance. And then in CUNY, I used to be at Medgar Evers, so I taught a African population that was from all over the world, Caribbean, Central, South America, and the continent. And yes, the Caribbean population generally has this view that they are the preferred, and this is, I'm articulating what some of my students have told me, and I've heard this before, but I have specific students who call themselves, because I teach history, that they were told by their parents and others that they were the preferred Black population in regard to the African American person. And but I show them evidence otherwise, right? So I don't debate with them. I give them evidence to say, okay, so you think that, let's deal with the historical facts. So this case is so important because it is a double-edged sword, right? I do want to state my intentions, though. the intention behind, other than uncovering the history, the true history, the truth, right, is that this is a model for us. Most of what's in this book is here to say this is valuable enough for us to model this. So
Absolutely.
what is the position, you will take in whatever respective country when it opposes African people from outside of that country? So if folks in a Central and South American country, the government, which is largely never ran by them, right? So, people could talk about the millions of Africans or Black people in Brazil or in Colombia. However, they still all live under racist governments. What
Facts.
what what if they enact policy or legislation that marginalizes or excludes African or Black people from them? What is the posture you assume, right? And or for the African population in any of these European nations, what if they enact legislation that closes out, that locks out, and this is very realistic, right? Because the whole issue with Europe and African immigration. What happens when they enact racist policies that lock African people, immigrants, out from those nations? What is the posture to assume? How does one perceive? What are the things that they can do? And so this becomes a model of that, in many ways. And it opens up the discourse and opens up the truth as to how U.S. policymakers feel about African people
Come on.
and Black people globally, right? And then it is a caveat on Washington's political position and posture, because as much as people may think he is a very American figure who is aligned, he's an accommodationist and all that. In this case, he is opposing U.S. government, and he is imposing American legislators, right? He is challenging them. He is in opposition to them with regard to this racist policy, right? And it's one of the first, I'm gonna say this, I'm gonna zip it so we can move forward, but it is one of the first times you see on record, because it's not the first time they tried this. It's just that I wasn't able to find the very first time they tried it, right? And it got, dissolved some other way. However, this is one of the earliest examples where you see them go on record and try to put African and Black people in the same category as criminals and undesirables. So it's here you see a criminalization of the African and Black population based on genealogy. And so that's notable, because we know in America to be Black is to be criminalized, right? And in other places in the world, it means something different, not necessarily good, but different. But in America, Blackness is automatically criminalized, right?
Absolutely. And I just want to say, Dr. Wright, that and you made that point clear that like it's absurd for, for African immigrants or our brothers and sisters who come here to operate with the mindset that they are the preferred, you know, Black immigrant or Black person or African person, right? Like understanding that literally, like you said, to be Black or African in America is to be a criminal. And so for you to think that you're the preferred is obnoxious, like it's perplexing. And so moving on, let's get into the Panama. Oh, hold on. Before we get into the Panama Canal, I do want to read, Dr. Wright, what you wrote when you talked about the clause in the larger immigration bill. So it was a larger immigration bill that was being proposed, but the clause, I'm thinking you actually have the clause initially said that the amendment stipulated the exclusion of all aliens not the Caucasian race, and then later the senator modified it to another statement, and it said all members of the African or Black race. But you state at the bottom of the first chapter, I'm sorry, of the first page of chapter 6, that it was specifically designed to exclude Africans from the Caribbean, Central and South America, despite their contribution to the building of the Panama Canal. And so, Brother T, could you talk about what that was, the building of the Panama Canal? So can we move there?
It's pretty interesting. For those who have the book, pay close attention to this page, because this just is a perfect example of how they use black labor to increase white wealth, or make them a superpower amongst other nations. And this is a perfect opportunity that America took, because French tried to build the structure of the Panama Canal at first, but it was a disaster. So it was an opportunity for the United States to show their engineering prowess to the world by taking on this task. But taking on this task, they solicited other nations, Caribbean brothers, South American, African descent, to help to create this Panama Canal, which was successful. But as is shown on this page here, that even though in 1901, when it was created, when it started, and then they completed, I believe, the canal around. They don't say what time we created it.
It's 1914.
Okay,
Actually.
November.
1914.
Yeah,
There
November.
we go. Sorry, my apologies. November of 1914. We see that 70%, not 10, not 20, not 30, but 70% of the labor force employed on the canal was from African descent, from the Caribbean, Central, and South America. One thing that I found startling in this part of the chapter is that when the work was done, America now was the superpower. They had access to trade, and because they was in Panama, which was powerful at that time, right? It was a powerful move for them to make. The people who built this canal wanted access, and this is what Dr. Ma'at was mentioning about the clauses that were put into this bill that excluded blacks. And I believe the Senator R.E.A.D from Missouri, he added it 2 to 3 times, changing it, making it more specific each time he created that one line. And the one line again, Dr. Ma'at, since you did read it, what was it? The line? Do you
So she says, and I'm at the top of page 113. So she says, like, on December the 31st, 1914, Senator R.E.A.D of Missouri added a one-line sentence which became an amendment to the larger immigration bill. The amendment stipulated the exclusion of all aliens not of the Caucasian race. And then she goes on to say, much to Senator R.E.A.D's chagrin, the measure did not pass. Dissatisfied with the outcome, Senator R.E.A.D moved to amend the bill again. And this time he was more specific. He injected a one-line statement which read, all members of the African or black race. All right. And then she goes on to articulate that a short discussion began on the floor with Senator Williams of Mississippi. And she says he was the first to argue in favor of the amendment. Now, check out what he says. Check out what this Yorugu says. He says, we are beginning to receive now some undesirable immigration of the African race from the West Indies. A great many Jamaican Negroes have been employed upon the Panama Canal, and at the determination of that work, have become accustomed to American wages, which they received down in the Panama. A great many more of them began to come to the Gulf ports. Florida and Louisiana have already received a considerable proportion of African immigration from the French and English West Indies. That is to say, immigration of West Indians who are wholly or partly African in race. And so before we move on, Brother T, I do want to convey to the listening audience, and this is what Dr. Wright wrote on page 112. If you go to the middle of the page underneath, the section entitled the Panama Canal, she says the U.S. financed the rebels in the region who wanted independence. So she leads us into when they started building it and why, right? And so she said it started in 1901 under President Theodore Roosevelt's administration. And she starts talking about how the US capitalized on the tensions between Colombia and the peninsula that would soon become known as Panama. So she says, opting against invasion, the US financed the rebels in the region who wanted independence from Colombia. Once the break between the peninsula and Colombia took place, the U.S. would be able to build its canal, and Panama would be an independent and free nation. Okay. And so I want to point out what they always do. They did it in Libya, right? They do it all the time. They go in and they finance the rebels. That's what they do to get what they want. The U.S. will go in there and give the rebels guns and different things and say, yeah, 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 go up against these people. And that's what they always do. And that's a strategy that they commonly use. And so I didn't feel comfortable like moving on without just kind of showing people that these people don't change, man. They use the same tactics over and over and over again. Dr. Wright, I see
Yeah,
your mic is muted.
I love that you got that. And so, yeah, just a couple of points. Absolutely, the United States exploited the conflict in Colombia, and that's very interesting because the dynamic there is a racialized dynamic, right? So here you have a territory that is a Spaniard territory, racist in nature, like most of the settlements in the Western Hemisphere in the Americas, right? Had enslavement, all of that. The rebels in Colombia that are trying to break away are Africans. They're Black. That's why if you look at the demographic breakup of something like Colombia versus something like Panamanians, most people understand that they are Black, and unlike some other parts of so-called Latin America, there's really never much debate about that, right? They're not one of the groups or nations that it's like, oh, we got to debate about what Panamanians are. And they generally identify as Black without an issue. But so look at how ironic that is, that the United States is financing Black rebel groups against Colombia. But it's not because they care about Black people or that they're aligned with some righteous cause or anything like that. It has everything to do with the fact that they want to cut through that landmass, and they're not going to negotiate with Colombia. And so they fuel this rebel this rebel faction in order to allow them to break away and establish their own nation. And then basically they have a relationship with them, and so now they can cut through this strait of land to open up the waterways and become essentially a world power as a result of being able to go from the Atlantic and Gulf into the Pacific without going around the land masses. So yes, absolutely, the United States doesn't do anything without economic interest in the region. They don't really care about people in that way, so that any humanist endeavor or anything like that, it's never that. Okay, if there's not economic interest in the region, then you're not going to see the United States there in
Not
any
at
real
all.
way. All right, and so other people had tried this, presidents before, and it had failed. Actually, the French had tried to do this same thing, this major engineering project, and cut through the landmass or do something to open up the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans so that people wouldn't have to, so they wouldn't have to go around the land masses, the continent, to trade. And they failed. The French failed at it. But the U.S. under Theodore Roosevelt would be very successful. I just want to note something so that people understand that this was all provoked, this exclusion measure, by the building and completion of the Panama Canal. Meaning, if you notice the dates that I give in there, the Panama Canal is completed in November of 1914. The labor force overwhelmingly, since it was an American project, it was definitively racist in nature and how it played out, meaning that it was segregated, right? So the Black laborers lived in different quarters. They were paid in a different way than the white administrators who were stationed on the project. The U.S. military was there on the project. And so they would call them gold roll and silver roll. in terms of the hierarchy on the Panama Canal. And so the black laborers that are there are all from the Caribbean, Central, and South America. The people would travel to work on this project. Okay. That being said, once it's completed, the United States wants to make it clear to all those who labored on the Panama Canal, who were overwhelmingly black from the Caribbean, Central, and South America, that thank you for your labor, but absolutely not on the question of immigration. That's why it's such a small window, meaning November 1914. And do you see how, if you're passing something on December 31st, 1914, that means you are anxious. Okay.
Absolutely.
You the last day of the year, you like, we are going to get this in because we want to make sure that we close the doors promptly so that we don't even have to deal with the appeals in terms of immigration from this population. So in other words, they finish the work 1 month before the year is out. They're like, we're going to get this in. And notably, a senator from Missouri, right? Missouri is infamous. That southern state in the north that still has issues, right? So this is where this senator comes from, James Reed. And so he plays around with it. But then once he hones in on and gets very specific, like anyone of the black or African race, it passes with flying colors in the Senate, and there's no dispute. Okay, there's not a lot of discussion. There's really no opposition. I think I put the numbers there about how the vote was. It was something like 29-0 or something like that. It was very easy, okay, to pass this. And what it was, when I say pass this, what was it? It was an amendment. It's the 19th Amendment to the larger immigration bill that comes before the House in 1915. So in the legislative record, it's there's various amendments to the legislation bill. And this is one of the amendments to the legislation bill to exclude anyone of the black or African race conclusively. So just to give you some specifics there. And so it's due to go before the House of Representatives the first week in January between the 1st and the 7th. And that's where the case, comes to bear in terms of Washington.
Yeah, and speaking of Washington, so Washington, it said that he found out because he regularly read the congressional record. Pause. Brother T, I had to highlight that. He found out because he regularly, that Baltimore lazy tongue. He regularly, we say regularly, but he regularly read the congressional record. And it says, and he communicated with officials stationed at the site of the Panama Canal. And so he read, see, a lot of our people, we don't even read. So stuff is going on, laws, bills, and stuff are being passed. And the only time we know about it is if someone puts it on social media, right? Someone puts it on social media, or is a tweet that go out, then it's like, oh, but he kept up with it. Not saying that he had access to social media back then. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is he made it a point to read and to keep up with politics.
Right.
He kept up with it. All right. And so he regularly read the congressional record, and he communicated with officials stationed at the site of the Panama Canal. It says he quickly educated himself on the clause and wrote an article challenging the stipulation, which he sent to several editors for publication. So he published an article, family, entitled Fair Play for Negro Aliens. And in that article, he argued that the amendment was, in fact, unnecessary and a slight to the masses of African, and in parentheses, Americans, residing in the southern U.S. He says the article began with an appeal to Congress and the American citizens through your newspaper. And this is in quotes. I desire to appeal. And this is the quote, actually, Brother T, I believe that you read at the beginning. Through your newspaper, I desire to appeal to the American Congress and to the people of the United States in favor of fair play and justice in connection with the immigration bill now pending before the United States Senate, which by amendment excludes from coming into this country any person of African descent. He also noted the hypocrisy. He said it was hypocritical. He said we're celebrating, the completion of this great canal, right? And it seems unjust. This is in quotes, unjust and unreasonable that the people who contributed in so large a measure toward it should be slapped in the face and told that they cannot enter this country even when they meet the requirements of our government. All right. And he warned that the bill wrongfully targeted African people from the Caribbean, Central, and South America, but in practice would exclude any person deemed African or Black, in part or whole. Washington highlighted some of the populations that would be denied immigration to the U.S. due to the clause. It says the bill would seem to prohibit citizens from the republics of Liberia. So guess what, T? Your sister, who is my BFF, I wouldn't know her. I wouldn't know you. Your father, who is from Liberia, wouldn't have come over, right?
Right.
It says right here, Cuba, Haiti, and also from Puerto Rico and Santo Domingo from entering the country, thus placing the unnecessary hardship on those smaller countries. This is Booker T speaking, which would not be done, in my opinion, if they were stronger. As Washington became more informed, he learned that the scope of the list extended to Jamaica. One of my closest friends, two of my closest friends are from Jamaica. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to a cookout tomorrow with the Caribbean folks. They're having something tomorrow. It's Caribbean kind of theme. But going over there to break bread with some of my Caribbean brothers and sisters. It said Trinidad. I have friends from Trinidad. Matter of fact, I was able in 2004 to go to Trinidad with one of my friends. She took me home when I was a student, at Morgan. I went home with one of my buddies from Trinidad. It says Panama and Costa Rica. All right. So Washington opposed the measure and used data from the 1910 census to argue that there were only 40,319 foreign-born Negroes in the U.S. and only 473 of them have come from Africa. Right? So he said there were never a large number of African people entering the U.S., and the measure would close the doors to African people immigrating from anywhere in the world. So Garvey wouldn't have been here, right? Wasn't Malcolm X mother or father, yeah, they were Garveyites, but weren't they? One of them was from, I think the father, Dr. Wright, you correct me. One of them was from one of them was from the Caribbean, right? Mm-hmm. So he wouldn't have been here. Get him out of here. And I'm sitting here thinking about who else. It's a lot of people who would not have been here had this measure have come through. And I love Dr. Wright at the bottom of 115 when you say there was never a large number of African people entering the U.S. at that particular time. Most of those folks came over in the 60s and the 70s. So you're right, Dr. Wright. At that time, it wasn't a huge influx of African people entering the U.S. in the early 1900s. Brother T, Dr. Wright, you said this was when?
473 entered from Africa during that time, I believe the consensus said, correct?
Yep, 473.
So it was amazing. Now, I love the fact the way Booker T used, number one, he kept up on what was going on in Washington. So that's a lesson right there. We have to understand what's happening, not just in our state, but internationally. He understood probably that they was living and working in unsafe conditions. 70% of the people working on that Panama Canal, as mentioned in this chapter, were from Central America, the Caribbeans, and abroad. So a lot of things he kept up, and he used the publications of that time to make them aware that that was unjust. So a lot of things that Booker T used, which I enjoyed reading this chapter, that he was up, like I say, not just up on what was happening. He was willing to use all the vehicles that was possible, not just his network, but the paper, also being update on all the constitutional laws to use to make his argument. And he used data, using a consensus in his argument to make sure that also went home as well. So,
and I love, and no, Brother T, hands down, that's a fact. And Dr. Wright tells us at the bottom of page 115 that Washington was particularly concerned about the students who would be denied access to the U.S. for educational purposes, right? Mm-hmm. She says there was always a steady stream of international students at Tuskegee from Japan to the Caribbean, and most certainly from Africa, right? And so, he's like, man, that's going to mess up my international, flow of students. Because remember, he was not trying to, he was exporting the Tuskegee model, to throughout the Caribbean, to Africa, right? Trying to build, institutions, right? Industry driven institutions, abroad. Because remember, as Dr. Wright always emphasizes, his form of Pan-Africanism was um, industry through independence through,
Independence through
through
industry.
industry. There we go.
Yes.
Independence through industry. That's what she always says. And so this was going to stop, his agenda as well. Dr. Wright, did you want to chime in?
Yes, I wanted to. There was one little line that I think we skipped over, and it said when you read off the different nations that it would impact in the Caribbean, Central, and South America, it said nevertheless it was not the nationality but the specification of race and African ancestry that constituted the offensive nature of the measure. So in other words, the United States didn't give you know what about the national identity of the African or Black population. What they were concerned about was the fact that you were African and or Black, right? So so this is an exclusion. So the United States right now locks out this country, locks out that country, but this is different. They're like, no, your phenotype, your genealogy, yeah, we locking you out on the basis of race and ethnicity, right? Like you are racially Black or you are African in any way, culturally and phenotypically, you're getting locked out. We don't care if you're from Jamaica. We don't care if we don't care if you're coming from the UK. See, that's the other part people don't get. Like you could have been an African person coming from the UK. No, you're locked out based on. And so then of course it begs to question, so who's determining who is Black and who is not, right? That's the other question, because this construct of race is certainly just that, a construct, right? So one, we know African people could be in the same family and look very different from each other all over the world. So that's one factor. But he is very clear that this is a racialized, and race is what? It's a superficial categorization in the sense that it is based simply on physical appearance, right?
Right.
So just how you look. So that's one thing. But then also too, there was one other little point I wanted to make, which is that yes, he did read the congressional record, and that to me says something about him. He would read the congressional record, and that's not the posture of somebody who, even if it is under Theodore Roosevelt's administration, that's not someone who trusts the U.S. government. Okay, I think he definitively felt like he should keep an eye on them. That's my opinion, just based on what I know in terms of his correspondence around this particular case. Somebody who's keeping her eye on American politicians and how they legislate is not someone who trusts them.
That's a fact, Doc.
Right. That's someone who is leery of them. And so he's keeping his finger on them, and he's got his ear to the ground at all times. Right.
No, absolutely. And I can actually agree with that opinion. Like you said, we don't know for a fact, but like someone that's distrustful, of the government, like you said, you would be sitting in there reading the what do they call it, Doc? The
The
congressional record.
congressional record. Right. So
Exactly.
right. So like as they're legislating, you get to see what's coming up, what's coming before the House, how they're voting, all of that. And so he would, whatever his means was of accessing that, he was accessing it regularly, which is why he gets the clue, in the cue that this is coming down the pipe. And then he acts on it. But you all began to say all the people that wouldn't be allowed in the U.S. Absolutely. And most notably, you'll see the very, there's a little more to say about Jamaica and other places, but most notably, by this time, he's already in contact with Marcus Garvey when this is taking place. He comes in contact, with Marcus Garvey in 1912. And so during this time, they're they're communicating right up until Washington's death. So he has already invited Marcus Garvey to the United States. If he fails to challenge this legislation, which is actually directed at the very population that Garvey would be, come part of the world and population that Garvey is a part of, Garvey will not come into the United States the very next year. So Garvey
Mm-hmm.
comes in the U.S. in March of 1916, and I don't want to ruin it, so I'll leave it there. But if this doesn't, if this, if Washington fails to do what he intends to do in this particular case, there is no Garvey in the United States. And I saw somebody in the chat say, and Malcolm X, his mother is born in Grenada. Absolutely, no,
Thank you,
no
family. Yep.
beloved Malcolm X. I always say that. No, no Malcolm X, no Nkrumah to come here, get politicized by African people here, and go
Lincoln
back to
University.
the continent and lead this continent to liberation under colonialism, right? Defeat colonialism in his country. On and on and on and on. So many would not have been able, and the coalescing. Let's not even just not come here, and so we wouldn't have them here, their parents here to produce them, but also the people who would come here, like you pointed out, Dr. Mott. There's a reason why African people from the continent, other places are coming. They're coming to be educated in places like Tuskegee, because Tuskegee is a hub at this point for international students, African students, because Washington is involved programmatically in doing something very specific. He is seeking to, share the Tuskegee model with African communities around the world globally. But he is particularly partial and interested in the African continent. That's undeniable. If you ever read the story of the Negro, you know that, right? And I give you enough in here to know that as well, right? That he has an affinity for Africa because of his relationship with Africa,
Mm. And
personally.
and Doc, I just want to add this. He wanted the African people, his international students, to go back to their country and help their people. At the top of page 116, I highlighted that and I said, not happening anymore. Let me tell you why. When I've gone to different places and talked to different students, even gone to different African countries, the children would say, we want to go. And if we want to go to Europe, they want to go to Europe, they want to go to the UK, they want to come to America, and they want to come and stay. There, no one is really talking. I don't want to say no one, because you might somebody might say, Dr. Mott, I know one person, right? And then my theory is gone, right? Or my claim is defeated. But what I'm saying is that's not the common way of thinking in 2022. A lot of immigrants, and even I teach at a university, Dr. Wright, and so I come across Ghanaian students, Nigerian students, students from Kenya, and a lot of them are like, yeah, when I graduate, I'm trying to get a job and kick it in America. I'm not going back to Nigeria. I'm not going back to Ghana. I'm not going back to Kenya. I'm not going back to Jamaica. I'm not going back. I'm staying here. I like it here. And so I highlighted it at the top of the page because it just kind of it shows you how far we are removed from the way our ancestors thought. And so they were saying, okay, let's get this information. Let's go to America. Let's go to Tuskegee. Let's get the model. Let's go back to Africa. We're going to implement the model. We're going to build institutions. Okay, that's going to teach the model, so that we can be liberated, right? Or be independent. But they're not. That's how they were thinking. A lot of the students nowadays, they want to stay in America. They want to stay in the UK. They want to stay in Europe.
I totally agree with that. And I would say that there was some of that sentiment back then too. And you'll love the fact that at the end of the book, in the notes section, instead of a whole bunch of different notes, I actually give Washington's address at the International Conference on the Negro, where he addresses that specific issue. And he not only stressed that for the international students, but he stressed that for the domestic students too, right? That your mission, first of all, to come to Tuskegee, because you have to realize that a lot of the students were not paying tuition. Most of them were not. They're there on the work program. So he is like lecturing them on the sort of the right to return and the obligation to return. And he sees the opportunity for them to be at Tuskegee, a possibility for them to be a part of the institution's sacred mission, that you go back to your community and you build, not come and then change your whole trajectory and then abandon your community and all of that. So he preaches that for the students internally in the US, but he more importantly, if you look at the notes, just for the purpose of this case, you'll see that, and that's why I put it there, just so you know. I put it there because people need to see his full lecture on at the International Conference on the Negro, which highlighted that very thing, how students come and they have this love for their own countries. And then after they're here in the US for a while at Tuskegee, then their attitude about their country begins to change, and their attitude about going back and implementing the work changes. And he's like, no, you have a sacred mission. You are obligated to go back, to return, and implement what you have learned. Okay, so that's
Absolutely.
the whole concept there. But absolutely, the students, I deal with the same thing, Dr. Mod. I have a more mixed population that I teach now,
Mm.
international, but it's still a very international population. And yes, I don't hear uh I have, so I'm not trying to hate, but I definitely don't hear my students from the Caribbean speak about returning to the Caribbean
Mm-mm.
and building. Okay. And we know that, like, it's no brainer. Those of us who are Africans, who are born in this country and have been here for many generations, we know the tensions between the African population in the United States, at so-called African American, and the Caribbean population. And yes, the question is like, wow, you don't want to return and build your country? You don't, that is not part of the conversation at all. It's a very much, sort of forsaken, their country to a large degree. And so the continent of Africa is the same, but for the most part, I do know a handful of continental African people who return and try to do some things, or at least are in closer touch. But in terms of the Caribbean, I can say overwhelmingly the students that I've taught in New York in particular, that's never a conversation. So it's kind of like, so you're not really aligned with the Black people here, but you sort of like, negate the people from your country that are still back home. You don't really help them, but you are, you sort of one up them because you're in America. Is being in America a good thing or no? And so it's a lot of nuance, complexity going on there. And it's very interesting because the idea also is like, so if you understand what America is, what makes you want to come to America at all? Right. And luckily, meaning that for the people who come conceptually, they don't think that we're still in slavery. They know that we're not. Do you get what I'm saying? So you actually are coming to do something to benefit. Now, thank goodness, the attitude internally by people like Booker T. Washington and others, because you'll see there are others who are aligned with him, but they have no power to influence the situation. And I'll let you all say who that is. So,
Oh
but
yeah.
but it's good that we weren't begrudging of any other group of people, because that could be the attitude. So the narrative now that is pushed is that, African Americans can be like, oh, I don't want other Black people to come here, they're taking my jobs, there's this, that, and other. You don't see any semblance of that conversation, and I didn't find any semblance of that kind of conversation in the papers and in light of this case. Do you understand? The idea is that the African population, from wherever African people are coming from, African and Black people, are coming, yes, to benefit themselves. He's very clear on that. Okay. And he's unwilling. And so that's the spirit too that I actually respect, right? Because he's not in competition with them. He's
No,
saying, we have fought these battles, we have won these battles here,
Right.
and yes, you are welcome. the
And let me.
problem the problem with what's going on now is that
Mhm.
there's these dissension in terms of I can definitely say the Caribbean population has been programmed to have a certain attitude, which is so ironic to me, because as an African person born here, when I go to any part of the world where there are African people, I respect the ancestors that did whatever was done in that country. I never
Ashe.
disrespect them. But there's some other spirit that's here when we're talking about Africans who come from other places. They feel very comfortable, as per maybe propaganda by whites, to disrespect the African population that has been here, that has struggled and has held chaos back so that they can come here. You
Right.
understand? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Right.
No, absolutely. I just wanted to add this because this is just kind of in addition to what you were saying. So in the
Mhm.
middle of page 116, you wrote this, Dr. Wright. This is something that Booker T. Washington said. He said, I hope that all my people will see the justice of asking Congress to refrain from perpetuating this unjust act upon my people. So, sorry, he said upon my race. So he wasn't just talking about African Americans when he said this. He
Mhm.
said upon my race. So he's talking about all of African people. You see what I'm saying, Dr. Tyrene? And so I wanted
Yes.
to make sure
That's
that
what a
we
Pan-Africanist is.
exactly. And so when I read that, I had to highlight that. I was like, wow. He says, you know, I want, you all to refrain from perpetuating this unjust act upon my race. That's what he wrote. And when he said my race, he wasn't just talking about African American people. Like you said, he was talking about all African folks. And so then he goes on to say, it says, in addition to the writing the article, he began his own very diligent letter writing campaign, creating a buzz around the issue on January the 3rd, 1915, 4 days before the House of Representatives were due to vote. Washington wrote Whitefield McKinley and many others asking them to oppose the bill. So then the Tuskegee Machine kicks in, right? So so it says he started using the Tuskegee Machine, right? And at the top of page 117, Dr. Wright writes, beyond working to secure political appointments, Washington now effectively organized against the proponents of the measure. I paused right there and wrote a note. So working to secure political appointments. So he was involved at who sat in those chairs, right? Brother
Mhm.
T, a lot of us don't even get involved. We like, I ain't going out there. I ain't doing that. It says that he secured political appointments.
Mhm.
Okay. So there were some people that he helped to get in those seats. It was some people he helped get elected. So he had some pull, he had some connections. And she wrote that he now effectively organized. Shout out to Dr. Takai Kilimanjaro. He did write a book called On Organization, and he criticized us for our inability to organize effectively. Because there's a difference between just organizing. Some of us just
Right.
organize, you can organize, but are you organizing effectively? And so Booker T. Washington, not only was he involved in securing political appointments, he also knew how to effectively organize. So she goes on to say that Robert Russell Moulton responded to Booker T. Washington regarding his efforts. I hear echo, Brother T. I'm gonna mute you for a sec. So it says Robert Russell Moulton or Moulton responded to Booker T. Washington regarding his efforts to oppose the measure. The Tuskegee Machine was in motion, and Moulton assured him, "We are taking up the matter of the immigration question with vigor." It says Dr. Frissell is communicating with all of our trustees as well as with our representatives in Congress. I'm doing the same thing. So the Tuskegee Machine has now kicked in. And she tells us on page 117 that the exclusionary amendment created unlikely alliances among African American leadership in the U.S. They all vehemently opposed it. So George Cleveland Hall, a mutual friend between Booker T. Washington and Monroe Trotter, and she talked about Monroe Trotter, I believe, like in the earlier chapters, maybe chapter 1, and she talked about how he was one of Booker T's staunch critics. And so what she
Was
what
Trotter also W.E.B. Du Bois? Was that the friction? Was
I don't know, Dr.
Yes,
Wright.
yes, yes,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
Dag, brother T, you took me back. I didn't remember that. So you said he tried to refresh my memory really quickly because I do want
no?
to move on.
This is the reason why W.E.B. Du Bois and also Booker T had the little strife in
Falling
their
out.
relationship to fall
Yeah,
out because he wound up going with Trotter, which was a staunch, when I say enemy, but it'd be too strong, or
Critic.
critic of Booker T's and also Booker T's Tuskegee Machine.
Right, because
yes.
Trotter was going, yeah, and then and W.E.B. Du Bois was sending letters, I want to come work for you, and blah blah blah, and then yep, he got mad with
So so can
W.E.B.
I
Du
say
Bois.
it?
Well, yeah, go ahead, say it, Doc. Go ahead, say it,
So
Doc.
so
I don't
yes,
want to butcher it.
there's great irony in this situation because yes, this unlikely alliances in face of this racist measure, right?
Hmm.
So yes, Trotter has a paper of his own. The title of the paper escapes me at the moment, but he's one of the few black papers that are not influenced by Booker T. Washington. Washington doesn't have a monopoly or stronghold with his paper,
Guardian.
and he's a staunch public critic of Booker T. Washington. The conflict between Du Bois and Washington arises for Washington as a result of Du Bois going to Trotter in the summer of 1903, which is the same summer that same year Souls of Black Folks would be released later in the year.
Hmm.
After spending the summer with Washington in Tuskegee and his family, he goes to Boston after the Boston riots and he commends and publicly congratulates Trotter on how he managed the situation as leadership in Boston. Not that he was part of the riots, but as Black leadership in Boston. He commends Trotter for his handling post the riots. Now, Washington is offended because he's like, Du Bois, you just stayed at my house, coalesced with my family. Now you go to my
Right.
very public enemy and congratulate him in a public realm. And this guy slams me on a regular basis in his paper. Now, the other irony is that so those two are aligned against this measure in this case. But the other irony is this: Du Bois' chief issue with Washington. And this is why, history is just such a great thing because we can find these things out. We don't have to speculate about stuff like this. It's written, it's there
Hmm.
in all of these ancestors' own writing. The issue that Du Bois had with Booker T. Washington was not a programmatic difference because we know there really wasn't a programmatic difference, right? If you got through chapter 2 on Booker T. Washington, Pan-Africanism and Pan-Africanist. His real issue, in his own words, was Booker T. Washington's use and even abuse of his secret weapon called the Tuskegee Machine. That is
Mm.
his real issue with him. Why? Because Washington could silence anyone he wanted, except for Trotter, probably. But
Right.
anyone else he wanted to silence, he could silence them through the black press, which he had significant control. But in this case, it is the Tuskegee Machine, and I don't want to jump too far ahead, but it is the Tuskegee Machine, as we're about to get into it, that will make a definitive difference between the Trotters and the Du Bois and any other black leadership that oppose this measure. It is the difference in power, right? None of them have a machine or a secret network that can influence US policy and legislation in the way that Washington will do. Okay? So it really is I hate to say it like this, but it's kind of a separate the men from the boys kind of situation because we can all raise our voices and oppose something, but who can impact the power dynamics? Who has the power to impact the actual legislation? And Washington definitively does.
Hmm. Hmm. But what I like, Doc, is that I'm sorry. I just got lost. I was getting ready to say something, Brother T, and then I lost my train of thought. But when you finish with the alliances question, that's what I was going to ask you. And because T yelled it out, he said the Guardian. That's not same Guardian today, is it? Can't be, right? The same Guardian, like the online
Not that I
newspapers.
know of. No, no,
Okay, I
not
just
that I
wanted to
know
make
of.
sure it
No.
was no connection between the Guardian that we have out today and Monroe
No.
Trotter's Guardian. Okay, all right, okay,
No, I don't
all right,
think so. I've
okay.
never heard that.
Okay, all right, good, 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 good. So anyway, it says moving on. I'm on page 118. You said that the lieutenants of the Tuskegee Machine were prepared to appeal the several. I'm sorry, the lieutenants of the Tuskegee Machine were prepared to appeal to several key representatives regarding their vote. The network focused on Republican House Representatives William Edgar Barra, Martin Barnaby McFadden, and August Peabody Gardner. So it says after the first day, there was a guy named McKinley, and McKinley was giving Booker T. Washington play by play. And so, Dr. Wright, so you're reading this stuff. And when I was reading that, reading this, Brother T, I'm sitting there in my mind, like envisioning her at home reading the playbook because they wrote everything down because it wasn't like, they could pick up the phone and be like, all right, let me grab my cell and call and say, hey, I'm in, New York, I'm over here, and this is what's happening. They had to write back and forth. And so I was sitting there just imagining Dr. Wright reading this stuff. But anyway, I'm glad that you did. So there was a play-by-play, right? Well, Booker T. Washington was given, play-by-play what was going on. And McKinley mentioned Madden, and how Madden's objection kept the bill from going to the conference today in hopes of tomorrow to eliminate the measure. He says we plan to see Gardner and others tomorrow. We feel, hopeful. She goes on to say that Madden was determined to keep track of voting, made it clear, that all he wanted was an understanding that the amendment be brought. So they playing these games, Brother T, on the floor, right? Madden is. And it says at the top of page 119, on January the 7th, 1915, the House of Representatives met again, and Representative Madden not only led the session, but delivered the first arguments in opposition to the amendment. She says a ferocious debate ensued, and each side argued vehemently over the issue of African immigration. She says an epic encounter, no less, but in the midst of it all, Booker T. Washington's words were heard on the floor of the House through Representative William Cowder of New York. I butchered that. So Booker T. Washington's words were heard on the floor of the House through Representative William Cowder of New York. So literally, Cowder now is echoing Washington, and he quotes, the statistics that Washington offered in his article, about African, immigration. It says he even referenced Madden's arguments, which highlighted the many contributions made by African people already in the U.S. He also identified a hidden aspect of the amendment, which placed the African population in the same category. And this is what Dr. Wright was talking about earlier, the same category as criminals and undesirables attempting to immigrate to the U.S. So at the bottom of page 119, she tells us that the House of Representatives debated the validity of the amendment for as long as allowed, and then, in quotes, by a vote of 74 to 253, with 99 people not voting, the measure to exclude all persons of African or Black race was rescinded. So then later that day, McKinley wrote Booker T. Washington and gleefully told him the objectionable measure was overwhelmingly defeated. Grink and Miller deserve the heartiest credit for their tireless fight, he noted. Did anyone want to jump in? It's like, hold on, give Booker T. Washington the beep, 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 beep.
He put some work in.
Absolutely. Can I just inject one thing? So picture this. He sends this group of men to DC, where this is taking place. And what they do they basically infiltrate the House of Representatives while they're in session. They're there and they're watching what's going on. And yes, through wire, they are communicating with Booker T. Washington. This is what happened today. This is what's going on. I don't know if you saw in the midst of where I'm recounting what's happening. they sent a wire to him, and essentially they're communicating, and they decide to hold up the House of Representatives by forcing a poll so that they're not wasting their energy on just everybody. They know exactly who's in favor and exactly who's not a favor of the measure, right? So polling means that each of them have to tell how they intend to vote on this particular bill, an amendment to the larger immigration bill. And so that's how they're able to focus their energy as well. So they, this is like, this is a playbook on how to challenge US policy and pressure US politicians, and right in the midst of, the process, right? The legislative process. So they hold up the Congress and get a poll. Now the people on the machine, the lieutenants, as they call them on the Tuskegee Machine, are able to focus their energy and lobby and directly approach and challenge specific politicians who they feel like, who have basically admitted to voting one way or another. And so then they get another vote after that. But there's a lot of maneuvering. And yes, I'm reading this directly from the congressional record, because it's just like you see a stenographer in court. Every utterance is written down. So this comes from the the official congressional record, right? So that's the other reason why, side note, when people are like, no, I don't believe it, blah, blah, it's like, listen, this stuff is right there for you, but you got to know where to go, and it's a no-brainer. But if you dare to go look at it, it's there. So it's not about a debate or anything, you understand, as to whether or not this happened or not. It is a matter of historical record and fact, not just in Washington's personal papers, but in the official U.S. congressional record. Okay, what's happening in the Senate, what's happening in the Congress. And so the other thing I want to highlight, and I don't want to steal the thunder or anything in light of it, but you see that last line that you read about Grink, right? That's Francis Grimke. And Francis Grimke is somebody, and this just gives you an indication of how sophisticated, I guess you could say, Booker T. Washington was. Because Francis Grimke, if you look him up, you'll know that he is somebody who looks like a public opponent to Booker T. Washington. And they had a secret relationship. Many people probably didn't know in real time that he was a part of the Tuskegee Machine, because publicly they were not allies, but behind the scenes they were. And so Grimke is one of the major players in this, infiltration of the Congress on behalf of this, effort to throw out or to get the African Exclusion Measure rescinded. And so you see him say, he there's a little bit there about that, but I just wanted to highlight that because this guy is someone who is playing at a whole different level. We're not even playing at this level in this day and age. Okay.
Not at all.
People have
Not at all.
So-called beefs over total nonsense, and there's really nothing going on in public realm or behind the scenes that's to our benefit. But this is what they are doing. They are understanding that they are aligned on certain issues, and that everybody doesn't need to know everything, right? And so some of the relationships that Washington has publicly, they're not really what people think they are. This man is not someone that people would think is an ally of Washington's, or that they're even friends. He publicly has criticized him, but yet and still he's on Washington. He's a lieutenant in the Tuskegee Machine. And the Tuskegee Machine is all about power dynamics and pretty much brokering to advance the interests of African people. And so you see, in this case, those relationships are laid bare, and it's sort of exposed because Grimke is right up there in the mix in Washington, D.C. And I'll let you, there's a wire Washington sends, and I'll let one of you, Dr. Meyer or Brother T, say what Washington said to them about. Did you catch what he says to them mid-case in the mix of this? Should I say it, or did you guys see it? So,
No. I didn't see it. So tell me
so in
where are you? Which page?
I'm not even looking at the page,
Hmm.
and I don't have my glasses on. Let me see. Hold on. Well, I'll just tell you what it is. But he sends a wire to them, and I think it's through Grimkey. But he says, go to Washington D.C. and pull every string possible to defeat this unfair measure.
Oh yes, he said that a few pages ago. Uh-huh.
Right, exactly. So he's telling them in essence, do whatever you got to do. Like, don't you dare let this pass. Pull every string possible. I read that as, that I see that as, for lack of a better term, the ruthlessness that Washington had. But as I said in the past, we're so used to people being ruthless towards us and not ruthless for us that we
Ashe.
don't even know what that is. He's like, you better not let this thing pass. Pull every string possible, meaning whatever you got to do, uh,
Yeah.
you do it,
Say
okay,
that,
and you
Doctor
bring
Doctor
back the
Wright.
results.
Dr. Wright, repeat that once again. We're so used to people don't say what?
Yeah, we're so used to people being ruthless to us and not for us that this doesn't even register to us, right? So I don't know a figure who is like, go and do whatever you got to do in particularly in a political realm for not just African people in one particular place, but African people globally. That's what he's saying. We're not going to allow this to happen. And so, and you're on point, Dr. Ma'at, about, yes, when he says this is directed at members of my race. Now, just imagine if Booker T. Washington were like many of our people today, that they don't know that they're African wherever you see yourself at. If somebody had to school him that, hey, you're actually African, this thing would have passed before he got the understanding. He comes into this situation understanding who he is and who African people are globally. So when the United States didn't have to name the nations, he names the nations that it will impact. But he understands when they say black or African race, he's like, those are my people, and I'm not going to go for it. And so he doesn't have to get schooled by anybody as to who they are, even though there are folks today in some of the parts that were targeted, South America, who are still struggling around blackness. Okay, still struggling. Forget African identity. And there's people within the United States today who still struggling around at least African identity, right? And in the Caribbean, certainly still struggling around African identity, not putting African first or have an African identity that precedes their nationality. So he didn't have to be educated. He comes, all that we read in this book that leads up to these two cases that are the evidentiary cases, all of those set of experiences which transform him and transform his thinking gives him the understanding of, as one of my professors used to say, who he is and where he is. He can define himself in the context of time and space, and he knows that he's an African in America. He knows that these are Africans in various locales, the Caribbean, Central, and South America. So he doesn't have to be educated and told who they are. And if he had to in that week, this case is only about 8 days long. It's done by January 7th. Okay. So had he had to be educated on who he was and who African people and Black people were in these locales, this thing would have passed and been gone
Absolutely.
before he figured all of that out. He comes into this already understanding and functioning as a he's able to act because he's already in the know. And so that's what's so significant about this particular case, because some of us don't have that understanding today. This is why we can have these struggles between ethnicities here, right? Oh, I'm from the Caribbean. Really? You're an African who got dropped off in the Caribbean. You're an African who got dropped off in South America, and we're Africans that got dropped off in America. Okay.
Right. I mean, and
And the
that's
US government
that's a
knows
fact.
that. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
and that's a fact. And one thing I want to close because I want to end in like less than 5 minutes. But one thing I would like to point out that you wrote on page 120 is that you said he said, however, had all else failed, Washington suggested in his letter to Henry A. May, written after learning the bill had been thrown out, that he would have gone directly to President Woodrow Wilson and asked him to veto the bill. When I read that, I said, who has that much juice? He said, if all else fails, I'm going to the president and I just have him veto that shit. I mean, that's what he basically said.
Yeah. Yeah.
Look,
And
T,
the
look,
ir-
look,
but
look,
the
T,
ir-
look, T, on the, see, you gotta hit it.
You gotta think about it, right?
and
That's
the
what he
irony,
said.
yes. And the irony about that is that Woodrow Wilson, he was a staunch racist. Okay. If you look at, who Woodrow Wilson was. But Washington is like, I don't care. He was about it. He was like, okay, if this pass, if all my efforts fail, I'm prepared to go to Woodrow Wilson and be like, what's the deal? Because he's not an advisor to Woodrow Wilson, but he has been an advisor to Taft and Roosevelt, the two presidents leading up to Wilson, right? So Wilson is just coming in, right? And Roosevelt and Taft had just gone out, right? Those two Republican administrations. So yeah, he's like, so once again, the guy is you could describe him as ruthless. He doesn't have any air to him. Like there's something I wouldn't do. He's like, yep, there's almost nothing I wouldn't do for this particular group of people, my people. Period. And you have to admire that because we have so many. We're not like that. That's all I can say. We are not like that today. We're like, I can't because so and so. Listen, he was like, I don't care who he is. I'm going to go and challenge them on this issue, period. Because this is, he actually does use the term racist and unfair measure. And so, that just shows you his clarity in who he serves and why. He's not confused at all. And we are unfortunately so confused 117 years later, very confused about a lot of things.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so I want to shout out Sincere Love. My boy said it's always heavy info on this channel. Absolutely. And sometimes people say, Doc, this is a little heavy. Can you go a little light on me? We don't have time for no light information on this channel. We got to go hard. We are at war, family. So, what they say to you. I know it's a cliche. If you don't like the heat, get out the kitchen. So it's hot over here. So peace and love to you, brother. Sincere to God. And this comes, I actually view this as a compliment because this brother's a heavy brother. So for him to come on this channel and say that it's heavy info is definitely a compliment because this is this is a really, really heavy brother. Family, make sure you support the project. He has a beautiful album out. Is you can get it on Tidal. Actually, he said it's streaming on all platforms. I know, brother Sincere, someone said that they were trying to access your project on Spotify, but it didn't pop up. So I don't know what's going on with Spotify. But I know, family, I definitely listened to his album on Tidal. The album is hot. He wrote a song about Dr. Francis Cress Welsing. I think I might close out with just people listening to that song because that song was fire. So anyway, family, I see your comments. I'm going to try to share as many as I can before we close out. Dr. Wright, what are your closing words for the listening audience?
Well, thank you once again, Dr. Mott. I want to say thank you for your opening comments with regard to doing this. I didn't want to interrupt the flow, but thank you for just the opportunity to sit in on this, right? And make sure people, because this case in particular is one that could be misinterpreted, right? This isn't meant to be weaponized by ADOS or anything like that, even though I understand that. And that's a whole nother conversation because this does relate to that, right? Like, but it is meant to give the proper posture, right? What is our posture in relationship to other African people? So I won't go too deep on that, but I do want to say something, because there was a little comment in there that I saw, and I don't know if this person was trolling or whatever. Somebody said that African people in America, or so-called African Americans, aren't African. Listen, that's fine if one thinks that, and I don't want to go off the path of this conversation, but I know some people argue that we're indigenous Black. No problem. If you think that we're indigenous Black, the Native Americans in this country, they're losing land and all of that. They need organization. I think you probably should help them. For those of us who know we're African, hey, this conversation is for us. And this is the posture we need to assume as it relates to African people around the world. It doesn't mean that we don't think that we should have reparations in this country, because that's specific. It's about enslavement. And every African who was enslaved under any colonial force, they should take whatever model is successful to secure reparations and implement it and direct that at every colonial or imperialist nation, the French, the British, or whatever the case may be. So I know that's a whole nother dynamic. I hope I'm not going over the audience's head in terms of that. But what I'm saying is that this is not a debate about who deserves reparations. It's not a debate about we did this, so we're better than you, kind of thing. This is the posture we need to assume everywhere we are on behalf of African people globally. So like I said earlier, if you are in the UK or you're in France and they're invoking racist policy towards African migrants and immigrants there, this is the posture to assume. Okay, this is giving you a formula, a blueprint to build on. Wherever you are in South America, and those countries are still just unbelievably racist, even though they have large Black and African populations. If they're enacting racist policy, this is the posture you assume in order to challenge your government, okay, and force them to shut down their racist policies as it is applied to African and Black people globally. So it's a model that can be implemented, built on, and duplicated in various instances.
Excellent. And I want to take some time out to shout out Knowledge Born Allah. Knowledge Born Allah, just saw your comment in the chat, family. Peace and love to you. Peace and love to you. Brother T, what are your closing words for the listening audience?
This was an awesome chapter. Definitely appreciate reading it. But we had to remember this one thing. At this time, it was stated on page 120. I just wanted to quote that Washington, weather beaten and prematurely aging by this point, was heavily invested in the defeat of this bill. Had he failed, the Tuskegee would be cut off from a stream of international students. He fought so hard for this bill. This is why the vigor that was mentioned in this chapter, as each Dr. Ma'at and Dr. Wright was mentioning, how he was make sure he was going through all the channels to make sure that this did not pass. And it said in this chapter that he worked so hard on this, basically, they never put anything in the bill or passed anything that stopped Africans from coming to this country. So just let it be known that Booker T was mid-50. I think he was 55 or 56 when he passed. He did all this.
He was 55, Dr. Wright? I thought it was 30. Why I had 35
well, we
or
don't
40
really
in my mind?
know. We don't really exactly know how old he was, because remember, he's born in enslavement, so he doesn't have a birth
okay.
certificate. But
Okay.
he's actually a little. It's from what they speculate, right? So they think that he
So
was
about
born,
50.
he's
55.
somewhere in his late 50s, right? But
Okay.
that's the mark of enslavement, right? Not knowing, so he's somewhere. Someone's wrote, oh, he's born April 5th, such and such and such, but we don't really know.
We don't
that.
really
We
know.
can only go by when they documented his
passed.
birth on that plantation.
And
right?
T, I'm glad you said something, because in my mind, I thought that he passed at 30. I don't know why I had 35, 40 in my mind. So I'm glad that you said 55.
So around that time,
roundabout, yeah.
But we know that he passed away in November 1915, right after the same year of this fight to make sure this bill doesn't pass. just how much he committed. This all came from his dream and or his want of knowing his mother, understanding where she came from. His inclusion, never thought himself anything different from being African and being connected to all blacks all over the world to this point in 1915 that he fought so hard to make sure that no one would be denied access during that time frame with this racist bill. So it just this chapter was so powerful with all the information that was in it from the building of the Panama Canal and everything. And I definitely appreciate Dr. Wright for putting this in the manner that she did.
Yeah,
Thank you.
somebody. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. And someone put up a quote. I actually saw this a few days ago. He said no UK police shooting so-called black people 60 times and even once. Sad to hear an African American got shot 60 times, regards to his family. Yeah, I read about that. And so people in Akron, is Akron? Akron. I said Akron, Akron. But yeah, I heard about that. They said he was running and 60 times. I think they said it was like 80 bullets and like 60 bullets hit him. So people, are demanding justice for him. So yeah, it's a lot going on, family. And so, Dr. Wright, as always, will you be joining us next week for the last chapter? Because we're gonna
I'm
give
gonna
out,
try.
family. Because she be on the go. That's why I told you, T, when she calls, soon as she called me, I go boop, boop, boop. I don't care if it's 12 o'clock at night. When she calls me, I answer because Dr. Wright
Thank you.
she has so much going on, family. So she's, like I said, just to get her here, for 90 minutes is a blessing because she has a lot going on. So you said you're going to try because Doc, I wanted to give away, we're going to do
Yes.
3 books next week. 3 books we're going to give away, 3 of her books. So family, we're reading the book Booker T. Washington in Africa, The Making of a Pan-Africanist by Dr. Tyrene Wright. And so we're going to give out 3 copies next week. Okay, preferably at the beginning, right? I think at the beginning before we jump into the discussion, maybe that'll incentivize people to get here on time because you know how our folks, T, they come in, Doc, I'm here, 30 minutes for, I'm here, so get here on time, family, because not say tomorrow, next week, next Sunday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we're going to give away 3 copies of Dr. Tyrene Wright's book. Doc, you already mailed my copies off. I wish I would have thought of you signing them before you mailed them off.
Oh, okay.
Dr. Wright, can you please
Well, I'll
sign
sign
mine?
the other ones.
Yeah, can you please sign mine, the one that you
Yes,
sent out?
yes.
So we'll have at least one signed copy, family. One signed copy, family, of her book next week. We're going to give it out. All right, family. And so make sure that you tune in at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I don't have any closing words. I feel like Brother T and Dr. Wright said it all. I do want to end with the song because we have the artist in the building. Brother Sincere Love to God is in the building. He has a song to our beloved ancestor entitled Dr. Francis Cress Welsing. So I'm going to play the song. All right. And family, be sure. I'm glad I'm play that. I'm gonna put up while the song is playing, I'm gonna put up the email address to the president, Wayne Frederick. Okay, his email address is hu president at howard.edu. Let me say it again because I butchered it the first time. President Wayne Frederick's email address is hu at, oh my goodness, hu president at howard.edu. So his email address is hupresident at howard.edu. We're emailing him demanding a public apology to the Cress family for her termination in 1975. Brother Sincere Love to God, he has a hashtag he started on Twitter. And Brother Sincere, we need to do the same thing on IG. Hashtag apologize HU. Not Hampton University, but we're talking about Howard University, right? And so hashtag apologize HU. At the beginning of this broadcast, I showed you the email that I sent the president. Also showed you an email that another sister sent to the president. She CC'd me on. She actually blind copied me on the email that she sent to him. So family, let's make sure that we demand a public apology. one that's verbal and written to the Crest family. All right, family. So on that note, I will see you next week. Peace and Black power.
Yeah. Yeah. I shade to the ancestors. Dear Dr. Francis Cress Wilson, I just wanted to thank you for all the lessons you left us. So yes, I'm more than grateful. I read the ISIS papers when I was locked in them cages. It helped me through that time they gave me when I was a baby boy. I'm a man now. I understand now. Since you deciphered the symbols, I see they plan now. It's penis envy at the root of it all. The gun as a phallic symbol. I'm glad you had the balls to tell it. When you debated the scholars like Dr. William Shockley, you kept a godly composure in the face of these Nazis. These are valuable lessons. Still wish we had your presence. But would I trade to chop it up with you over some breakfast? When you went back to the essence, they sent their weak professors to throw dirt on your legacy. Yeah, they disrespected.
Oh, I don't even know what happened. Goodness. That did that to me the last time, Brother T. What's going on with this file you sent me, Brother Sincere Love to God?
I shade to the ancestors, root of it all. The gun as a phallic symbol. I'm glad you had the balls to tell it. When you debated the scholars like Dr. William Shockley, you kept a godly composure in the face of these Nazis. These are valuable lessons. Still wish we had your presence. But would I trade to chop it up with you over some breakfast? When you went back to the essence, they sent their weak professors to throw dirt on your legacy. Yeah, they disrespected the Yvette Carnells and Mark Lamont Hells. How could they stand in front of a mirror and face themselves? Professional white ass kissers fulfilling that scripture from the book of John Henry Clark. I just laugh at you niggas. I know you chilling with Dr. Ben and Asa Hilliard, Van Sertima, Auntie Diop, Chancellor Williams. Shout out to Dr. Sabi. Shout out to Delbert Blair, Laila Africa, Amos Wilson. We well prepared to walk in these giant footsteps that you left us. We give thanks and hope that these ancestors protect us. These are the keys to the color confrontation. Read it in weak motherfuckers. We know the basis of all your evil is genetic annihilation. That's why we gotta love ourselves more than we hate them. These are the keys to the color confrontation. Read it in weak motherfuckers. We know the basis of all your evil is genetic annihilation. That's why we gotta love ourselves more than we hate them.
If we do not understand that a war is going on of immense proportion, if we think it's fun and games, if we think we can proceed as business as usual, my answer is that we are not oriented and that it is a case of serious mental illness, meaning not able to face reality.
All right, family. I tried to get as many. Wasn't that hot, Brother T?
Yes.
Oh my gosh. Yes. Someone named Casey said this episode really needs to go viral because it would clear up so much garbage. All right, family. So make sure that you share the show, family. Share the show, and we'll see you next week. Peace and Black power. Peace.